So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of transparency in the antiques and collectibles trade. For those unaware, if you study finance, transparency in finance is very important. Well, it's relatively important in the antiques and collectibles trade, especially if we're going to allow the antiques and collectibles trade to function as a valid alternate asset class. And if you're watching this channel, that most likely is probably how you may potentially view the antiques and collectibles trade. Now, I know some of you out there, you may be new to my content. Please keep in mind, this is a collectibles finance channel. I look at all these markets through the lens of somebody who is attempting to allocate capital, i.e. invest in these markets, whether it be over the short term or over the long term. I know from the emails and feedback I get, that bothers some of you. But make no mistake, we are not going back. We're not able to put the genie back in the bottle. This is where we are in the year 2025. Antiques and collectibles are a valid alternate asset class. That doesn't mean I'm here to tell you that you should put all of your assets in antiques and collectibles. I teach responsibility. These markets work best if you use them as a diversification hedge. Meaning if you diversify capital into these markets, you're already financially established. This is where the antiques and collectibles trade can benefit you by being a well-versed, educated investor in these markets. Now, transparency is very important because it provides the backbone to easy to find, reliable, and readily available information related to the perceived market value of collectibles, their condition, population reports, if available. Again, this ties into third-party graded collectibles. And sometimes, especially on the antique side of the equation and also the high-end art market, the history of ownership. All these are very important components of transparency within these markets. Now, this is something also important, and again, some of you are going to get triggered by me stating this, but certain markets in the overall antiques and collectibles trade are more transparent than others. Case in point, believe it or not, it's actually very, very easy to find actual mintages of most U.S. coins. Now, this is obviously due to the legal accuracy and, of course, importance of accurate records kept by the U.S. Mint. But just keep in mind, other collectible and even certain antique markets, they don't have that advantage. Meaning even if you're able to find production runs on certain pop culture collectibles, it doesn't always mean that they are accurate. And this is something that you have to understand in the back of your mind. A transparent market always equals a more efficient market. And any time you have readily available information at your fingertips, you can become a better investor and take advantage of that efficient market. That's why all this is very important. That's why during the graded video game bubble, when I was going after a lot of games, when I was talking about the importance of transparency in these markets, you all by now got a lesson as to what happens when there's a lack of transparency in these markets. You have a couple of individuals or a group of individuals who are at the forefront of a speculative frenzy, or in this case, a speculative bubble. They were able to profit handsomely, while what happened? Over time, the bubble popped because we all knew this wasn't a transparent market. That's why the graded video game bubble popped. It all comes down to transparency. And this is something that you got to understand if you're getting involved in these markets from a financial perspective. Now, thanks to the power of the internet, investors, for the most part, operating in the antiques and collectibles trade, have access to real-time pricing data, population reports, as long as the third-party grading company in question chooses to publish them, information on how third-party grading companies grade and authenticate the items that they handle. This is very important, guys. This is why if you spend any time, if you go on CGC's website, if you go on PSA's website, if you go on the PCGS coin grading website, if you go on AFA, Action Figure Authority's website, they have a breakdown of their grading scale and how they come to the conclusion of why one item may be graded, I'll just use this as an example, in 9 condition, and another item is graded in 10 condition. Now, obviously, AFA, CGC, they use more than just a 1 through 10 grading scale, obviously. So you really have to take that into account with how their grading system and scale is set up. This is why in certain markets, we have a little bit of a problem. Like when I talk about graded video games, you have CGC, you have WADA, and you have VGA. Well, VGA, which is owned and operated by the same company that owns AFA, Action Figure Authority, they use a specifically different grading scale than that of CGC and WADA. So again, this murkies the waters a little bit here, where you really have to know the differences between those grading scales. So if you have, say, a factory sealed copy of The Legend of Zelda that comes up for bid, if it's graded by VGA in 85, and there's another copy graded by WADA Games in 9.4, and another copy still by CGC in 9.6, which is the highest graded copy? Now, obviously, in that scenario, it's very easy. It's probably the CGC 9.6, but you would be surprised if you crack open a VGA 85, sometimes they can come back in 9.6 grade if you cross-grade them. Not always. It's not guaranteed. It's not an exact science. But that's why you really have to understand the ins and outs of these markets. Now, another thing that's very important, and this becomes more important on the antique side of the equation, I want to make that very clear, is history of ownership, what we call provenance in the trade. History of ownership can actually add a lot of value to certain items. For instance, if there is a historic artifact out there that you're thinking of buying and you have proof that it was historically significant, maybe it was owned by George Washington, and you can prove that without a doubt, obviously that particular item is going to have a significant amount of value attached to it when it goes up for bid or when it becomes available for sale. This is vital. This is why a lot of you guys don't listen to me, but when you guys buy an antique or a collectible from an auction site or even through a third party or a well-established dealer, what is it that I tell you guys? You guys should be keeping a copy of that receipt, of that document that shows that you own that item, because it does stand to prove provenance. I know there are cases in the high-end coin realm where people have bought certain valuable coins from certain auction companies, and because they were able to trace the provenance, meaning they kept all that information, it actually does add a significant value to some of those coins. Now, it's not always a common occurrence. Obviously, no one really cares if you own a 1921 piece dollar graded by NGC or PCGS in MS64. But if you have a certain coin that has either a low mintage or is very historically significant, that can add value to that coin in question if you go to sell. The end result here, and I'm trying to keep this video under 10 minutes, is anytime you have transparency in these markets, it leads to market efficiency. Any disruption in market transparency, and that leads to a potentially inefficient market, which immensely increases risk. Much like what happened with the wonderful graded video game bubble that occurred and then came crashing down. Why did it come crashing down? Because there was a lack of transparency in the market at that particular point in time that I was able to see, other experts in the trade were able to see, as well as other YouTubers. That does not mean video games are not collectible. I'm here to tell you, vintage video games have a ton of organic collectability, and it's a very exciting market, one that I am watching very closely right now. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I will potentially see you in another video.